Hello and welcome to EE233. I'm your instructor, Gregory Myers. In this video, we're going to take a look again at our main in our fundamentals demo. If you've been following along in the earlier videos, we've accrued quite a bit of code and a lot of different examples in various different functions, and we've had to turn on and off each one of these functions. Now, this video assumes that you've worked through some of those examples already, as well as having looked at how to utilize the argc and argv command line arguments. So what we're going to do in this one is we're going to figure out a way to triage the arguments that are coming in from the command line in order to choose which one of our functions we want to call. And so the first thing we want to do is set up an extra function, a helper function, that will essentially serve as a way to instruct the user how to use your application. And so we'll keep this one fairly simple. We'll simply have a new prototype called void help, and help will accept no input arguments. So it's going to accept no input arguments, and it's going to return no output arguments. Now, before we forget, we want to go ahead and implement this. As a matter of fact, what we can do is keep it relatively close to our main so that we can remember to update it as we're going along. So go ahead and copy and paste the prototype. And then before you forget, go ahead and grab the comments from one of our earlier functions, paste them here, and clean up the name, which in this case, we're just going to keep the pattern of using the function signature itself, as well as the description. And this prints out help. And in this case, there's going to be no input or output arguments. In help itself, we want to take some cues from some of the command line executables that we might be using, particularly the one that we saw earlier called ipconfig. And I mentioned that if you use the /?, you'll get the help. The idea is that we want to do something similar to this. And so what we can do is we can start off with just something like usage. Now, whether you capitalize this or lowercase doesn't really matter. But the main thing that I would like for us to focus on are these examples here. So we basically start off by having a printf and something like usage followed by a new line. From there, what we want to do is we want to simply print out for each example or each option in our executable, we want to simply print out an example of how to use it. Well, let's get started first with building this main so that we can call different functions based on command line arguments. So basically what you're going to find yourself doing is bouncing between your main and updating your help. For right now, we want to figure out how can we actually call help? Well, just like in the command line argument of the ipconfig, if I put in a /? Or something along those lines, I would like to see the help. And so /? will display the help message. Another option is also the /h. So what we want to do is we want to figure out a way how to test what arguments are coming from the command line. And as I mentioned in an earlier video, we must have at least one argument because that's the name of the executable. Well, what we can do is we can use an if statement or a set of if statements then to determine what argument has been passed to the executable or to main. And based on what argument has been passed, then we can decide which one of our functions to call. So what we're going to do here is we're going to use an if statement, or more than one rather, to determine which function to call. Well, probably would be worth coming up with a relationship between the argument and the function. And we're going to keep this pretty simple. So I'm going to use the function name as the command line argument. Now, just to note here, this is arbitrary, meaning that this is just a preference of mine. As you get more sophisticated in your programs, you can get more sophisticated in your command line argument. So what I mean by this is basically if I want to call GetInfo, I would like the user to simply type in /GetInfo after the name of the executable. Well, to begin with, we can always start by calling help if the user doesn't type anything after the name of the executable. So the first condition that we will have is simply if our argc, or our argument count, is simply equal to 1. Remember that we must have at least one argument, and that's just simply the name of the executable. In that case, if argc is simply equal to 1, or what we can also do is we can say less than 2. In other words, that will also handle the scenario where we have 0, although that should not happen. But if our argc is less than 2 or equal to 1, then what we want to do is simply call our help. And this is going to be what I refer to as an implicit call for help. In other words, the user didn't specifically ask for help, but they didn't know what to ask for at all. Well, let's take this a step further. And in this if statement, let's have another condition to check. But this time around, let's assume that the user knew to call for help. So in other words, from the command line, they put in something like, and I'm going to go ahead and clear my screen. Let's say that they did something like this. Right now, it doesn't do anything other than parrot back to us the arguments that were passed. We'd like to see the help, and whether we use a /? or a /h doesn't really matter. Well, what we can do then is we can take a look at that argv square brackets 1. So if we've made it this far, we're guaranteed that we have at least 2 arguments. So what we can do now is we can have another if statement. So an if, else if, and that else if will use a new function that we haven't yet covered called string compare I. And string compare I will allow for us to compare argv square brackets 1, in other words, that second argument, to whatever string we would like the user to enter in. In this case, it's going to be /h. And we'll take a look at the help for string compare I in just a second. But basically, if there are 0 differences between argv square brackets 1 and our /h, in other words, if string compare I returns 0, then this means that the user has made an explicit call for help. And what do I mean by that? I mean that they actually ask for help. So let's leave it at this for right now. We can go ahead and put in an else, and we can come back to this in just a second. But let's go ahead and build this, and let's see if we've managed to accomplish anything. So we come out here to our command line, and we first type in just fundamentals_demo.exe, and you'll notice here that it not only recognizes that we have one argument, but it says that argv square bracket 0 is simply the executable, and then we have usage colon. Well, right now that's not terribly useful, but it does show us that our help function has in fact been called. And so we can follow this up by testing r/h, and you'll notice once again that it recognizes two arguments, argv square brackets 1, name of the executable, and argv square brackets 1, argv square bracket 0 is the name of the executable, and argv square brackets 1 is that /h, and once again our stubbed in usage. Now, let's take just a second to try to improve that help. And if you notice, we have our first command line argument to put in. So we'll go ahead and copy the name of the executable. And for right now, we are actually going to hard code this in here. There are ways to get around that. What I want to do is I want to take a second to provide an example here for the user. So in this case, it's going to be /h followed by the /n and then a semicolon at the end. And what you can do is you can also provide the user with some information, much like what they did in the ipconfig example. So you'll see here that they actually give some instructions or give some information about what it does. And this is not a bad format here. So let's go ahead and take a second to go ahead and introduce something like this. And we'll tweak the format as we see fit. But basically, doing this simply calls help. All right, so let's go ahead and save it. Let's build it. And let's come back over here to the command line. And now let's run our fundamentals demo.exe. And you'll see that we get our usage now. And it shows us how to call for help. You can see that we got kind of a nice similarity with our ipconfig. Well, that gets us help. Well, how do you think we would go about calling the rest of these functions? Well, it's actually just as straightforward. We'll continue to use our string compare I. And before we continue, I'd like to take just a second to note here that our string compare I is part of one of our other libraries. It'll take just a second, I'll pull up the help. It's part of several functions, but the two that we're going to use the most is going to be string compare and string compare I, with the big difference with string compare I simply being case insensitive, meaning that if a user types in capital H instead of lowercase h, it won't really matter. In both cases, though, string compare I will return 0 when there is a match. And so you can see some examples of this and also some code of how to use it. But note here that string compare not only returns -1, 0, and +1, but also other negative or positive values. All right. So anyway, we can take a look at some examples later, but we will be using the string compare I functionality. Let's go ahead and take a look now at our code. And if we also take just a second to right-click on our string compare I and navigate, go to the declaration definition, you'll notice that it's part of our string.h, which means that we need to go ahead and include it in our include list. So in this case, we can go ahead and include string.h. Now, back to the matter at hand with our main. How are we going to call the rest of these functions? Well, it's just a simple matter of adding another else if. And in this case, what we want to do is a string compare I of our argv square brackets 1. And what we want to do is we want to start with our GetInfo. And so the idea here is if the user puts in /GetInfo, we want them to call or see the results of our GetInfo function. So at this point, what you can do is you can simply move your code up and then uncomment it. Now, before we go any further, let's think about this. The only way that the user will ever see the GetInfo function is if they correctly type in /get_info and it matches using string compare I for the first argument. So in other words, if they type it in as the second argument, it won't work, and anything else won't call the GetInfo function. And let's test this before we go any further. So if we build it, we come out here to the console, our /h still works, but let's see now what happens when we type in get_info. Sure enough, there you go. We see the output from one of our earlier examples. As a matter of fact, apparently I still have more work to do on this one. I need to add in the information that I had put in as TBD. Well, what happens if we continue with this? So we'll start off with another else if, and once again, string compare I, argv square brackets 1. And at this point, why don't we go ahead and run the demo for figure 2_1. And so in this case, we can just copy and paste it. And if that's equal to 0, that means the user wanted to see figure 2_1, in which case we can simply just move the code up here and uncomment it. Well, we can continue to do this with each one of these. It won't do the user any good because they won't see how to do that. To fix that, we simply come down here and we provide some additional instructions in our help for each one of the switches. And so particularly our GetInfo, and we simply put the /GetInfo. We can spend a little more time cleaning it up. And then this one, we'll just keep the help simple. For right now, we'll say calls GetInfo. I would encourage you to do a little better than that. And then you simply can continue on with this for figure 2_1. A little bit of cleanup. And we build it once again. And now when we run our GetInfo, we get not only the GetInfo, but we also can see our figure 2_1. And that was the one, if you recall, prompted us for entering the distance in miles. I'm going to put in 1 mile, and it simply told you the number of kilometers. Now, what I'd encourage you to do at this point is to go ahead and pause the video and go ahead and bring these remaining examples into our else if structure. So once again, pause your video, complete it, and then come back in just a few minutes and let's see how we did. All right, welcome back. So hopefully your if statements look something similar to the ones I have. So basically what I've done is I've taken each one of our commented calls to the functions that we built in other videos, and I've simply turned them into additional else ifs to check the switch that was provided by the user from the command line to see if it matches the argv square brackets 1. And if it does, I make the appropriate call to the function. Now, keep in mind, there does not have to be a one-to-one relationship like what I've got here. This is just more for convenience and simplicity in this first example. The other thing that I've done is in the help is I've added each one of the examples so the user knows what switches or what option for arguments are available to them, as well as some basic information out here on the side. And once again, I've just kept this pretty straightforward. Now, this enables us to make calls to each of our functions, but then what we want to decide is what happens if the user misses the boat completely. In other words, they will build it, and aside from help, let's just say that they enter in nonsense. Okay. Well, right now it does nothing. But basically what it should do is if the user enters in some switch or some argument that we have not handled, in other words, if we've managed to go through all of these else ifs and they all return false, then we simply come down here to the else and we make another implicit call for help. Why is it implicit? Well, it means that the user didn't explicitly ask for help. They just did something that we were not prepared for, in which case we would like to show them the help. And so if you build it once again, and if you run it this time with a nonsense switch, we should see the help. Now, hopefully this looks pretty impressive to you because this should look a lot like our earlier IP config example. And you can see where you can just continue to build more and more functionality. I'd like to throw one final example in here before we're done, and that is using combinational logic. In other words, what if we wanted to test two options at the same time? And so earlier we were talking about the /h. Well, what if we also wanted to handle the /? One possibility would be to make a copy of these two lines and simply change the /h to a question mark. But that's completely unnecessary. In this case, what we can do is we can actually just make a copy of the string, the if condition, and we can make it compounded. So in this case, else if, and then I'm going to use in one extra set of parentheses here, else if our string compare I matches our argv square brackets 1 with /h, or using two pipe symbols, it matches, and I'm putting an extra set of parentheses out here. Notice how it's NetBeans is helping us match the parentheses, or it matches the /? So under either of these conditions, we will get this explicit call for help. And so it doesn't have to be both conditions. That would be an and. In this case, we want an or. So in this case, if I put in /h, I get my help. But also if I put in /? Once again, just a nice, cool little feature that we're going to be using later on. So hopefully you found this video useful. More importantly, you should now see how you can combine functionality into one executable. Our executable now has the ability to run 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different examples as opposed to just a single example. And we're going to continue to add on to this as we go along. But this allows for you to have one executable that can do multiple things. Once again, hopefully you found this video useful. If you have any questions or comments, don't hesitate to email me, and thank you for watching.